Hello and welcome to 168 Hours. I am Razmik Martirosyan, and today together with Dr. Artur Khachikyan, we will interview Mr. James Carden, a senior advisor to the American Committee on US-Russia Accord, editor and columnist at the American Conservative, and a former advisor to the US State Department. Thank you so much for making the time.
Happy to be here.
Let's begin with the significant topic in Armenia. The signing of a strategic partnership between Armenia and the United States. What does this mean? What to expect? We have statements from Lavrov, who said that signing a strategic partnership document with the United States is a sovereign decision of Armenia. However, he warned that the United States will require Armenia to participate in sanctions against third countries. So what to expect in this regard?
I don't expect anything good to come of it. After all, you might recall that the United States and Ukraine signed a similar sort of agreement in November of 2021. And then only 3 months later, Russia invaded Ukraine. It seems to me that this is part of a longstanding desire on the part of the American foreign policy establishment to wrest control of as many of the former states of the Soviet Union out of Russia's orbit and into the Western sphere of influence. Unfortunately, we've seen how this movie plays out before. In 2008, there was a pledge made at the Bucharest summit, the NATO Bucharest summit, on which we pledged to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. In August of that year, Russia invaded Georgia during the Six-Day War. And then, of course, the Maidan and the Ukrainian Civil War kicked, and, that was the issue over an issue of being, part of the Western sphere of influence. That kicked off in 2014, and then the full-scale invasion of February of 2022. So the idea that the United States is going to somehow become the security guarantor of Armenia instead of Russia, instead of Iran, might be appealing to bureaucrats in Washington, people who've never been to Armenia, people who probably couldn't find Armenia on a map. I think it's a very, very dangerous thing for the Armenian people, because what that is going to do is, in effect, leave Armenia vulnerable to the plans of the Turks. After all, nothing matters more in Washington than NATO, and Turkey and the United States are treaty allies through NATO. So this seems to me to be a very short-sighted and dangerous move on the part of the current Armenian government. But as Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov said, it's a decision that sovereign states have the right to make.
Will the situation change during the Trump's administration? What do you think? Because they are signing these during the Biden's administration.
No, I wouldn't expect any change from that. For U.S. foreign policy, despite the expectations that there's going to be some sort of great change from administration to administration, usually runs on autopilot, and it's really the unelected national security apparatus that calls the shots in Washington. It's not really responsive to the will of the people. What I would expect, and again, this is I feel terrible being the bearer of bad news to a country that I admire so much, but what I would expect in the Trump administration is that Europe and the Caucasus are probably going to fall down on the list of priorities for the incoming administration. I would expect that the administration is going to prioritize the Mexican-US border, China, the Middle East, Europe, and then places like the Caucasus and in Africa. So I think that unfortunately, it's not going to be top of mind for the incoming administration.
James, all eyes are on Washington. President-elect is soon going to take the office. The inauguration is in 6 days, I believe. You're very familiar with the discourse in Washington, in the media, in the so-called deep state or foreign policy elite, etc. What is going to be important for the new president in our region? We know clearly Israel is going to be very important. Turkey is very important. As you mentioned, those are strategic allies of the United States. Azerbaijan is probably going to be important in view of its gas and oil resources. What will be the U.S. priorities in our region? Have you ever heard of any government officials or pundits or political analysts say that there are vital interests in Armenia, that the U.S. has any kind of vital national interests or any kind of interests in Armenia?
I've never once heard that in all my years in Washington. The priorities in Washington, and especially under a Trump administration, are going to be energy security. That means oil and gas. That means Azerbaijan. And of course, the other big priority under Trump, but of course under all American presidencies, is the security of the state of Israel. So those are going to be the two, in your neighborhood at least, those are going to be the two overwhelming priorities: energy and Israel.
And Azerbaijan is an ally of Israel. As you know, Israel helped the Azeris defeat the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. That was 70% funded by, but not funded by, armed by Israel. All these weapons used against Armenians were from Israel. So there is a strategic partnership going on between these two countries. Well, my question is, President Trump made a lot of promises during his election campaign. He wanted to be the president of peace. But then there were certain choices made with certain people who were appointed to his administration, that people who are not necessarily very dovish. So what kind of a foreign policy is going to be? Is going to be a policy of war or peace? I mean, we know that there is some desire, there's some talk of upcoming negotiations with Russia over Ukraine. There's some rumors that Iran is also willing to negotiate. These are these huge conflicts, tectonic conflicts, Ukraine and potential conflict with Iran. Is it going to be peace or war, in your opinion?
Well, I would let's start, I guess, with Ukraine.
Yeah.
The incoming president and his advisors have expressed a desire to negotiate. The problem is that they don't really seem to understand that a ceasefire in place is completely unacceptable to the Russians. The Russians want a full-scale settlement, and the settlement must involve Ukrainian neutrality, meaning no Ukraine in NATO. Now, the president and his advisors seem to think that they can paper this over somehow. I don't think they're going to be able to. And given the way that the war is now unfolding, I see no reason for the Russians to agree to anything less than that. As you know, this whole thing could have been avoided with a simple pledge of Ukrainian neutrality. That isn't some horrible thing. It helped Finland get through the entirety of the Cold War, as did Austria, and it would have been a good thing for Ukraine. Look at the standards of living and the economies in Finland and Austria, pretty good. So neutrality has worked for a lot of these places. Switzerland, for instance, Ireland. So, we need to, the administration is going to have to get over its aversion to that word, neutrality. With regard to Iran, I'm afraid to say that I'm very, very pessimistic. The Trump administration is, if you can imagine it, even probably more pro-Israel than the Biden administration. And right now, after the overthrow of Assad, the Israelis, and they've been very public about this, they see kind of their chance. This is their chance to finally strike Iran. Now, Iran is very aware of that. A month ago or so, they agreed to renewed and more intrusive a new inspection regime by the IAEA. I would imagine they would be willing to sit down, of course, with the Trump administration, because they don't want to go through the experience that the Iraqis went through in 2003. But I fear very much that there's a real possibility that we will be involved in a war with Iran in the coming months. The administration understands as well that if they're going to do that, they have to act before the Russians wrap things up in Ukraine. Now, that would give them motive to sort of continue on with the Ukrainian conflict in order to distract the Russians from getting involved in helping to defend Iran. So, they might be saying one thing in public, yeah, we want the war to end, we want to negotiate. On the other hand, it would serve the interests of those who want a war with Iran to have the Ukraine-Russia conflict continue. So the prospects for peace, in my view, are really not that good.
I see your point. For as long as Russia isn't done with Ukraine, Russia is not in a position to really assist Iran, and it's a good argument. So it would not be in their interest to de-escalate in Ukraine, thus giving Russia an opportunity to assist Iran. There is some kind of a diplomatic dialogue happening between Russia and Iran. They are about to sign another strategic cooperation treaty. Is there any indication that Russia is going to stand by if the war breaks out? If a war breaks out with Iran, do you think that Russia is going to stand by or try to assist in some way or get involved in some way? I mean, anywhere between, providing weapons to Iran to kind of military involvement, which I don't think is very likely.
I can't imagine that they would sit on the sidelines. I don't think that they would get involved directly. But the problem is, of course, they have a war themselves that they are fighting. And I would imagine that if they were to get involved, they may try to act in ways that disrupt NATO and the American allies in Europe. That would probably be easier for them rather than actually getting directly involved on the ground in Iran. And of course, we don't know what shape the coming American-Israeli attack on Iran is going to take. It could simply be airstrikes. The Israelis have for years and years wanted to take out the Iranian atomic program. So we simply don't know. So there's a lot of obvious uncertainty in the region.
I understand. Yes, it looks most likely that they're going to try to strike at the nuclear installations in Iran. And Iran has just conducted military drills and kind of showcased its air defense capabilities. They are speaking about a massive retaliation if there is an attack on Iran. And some analysts that I've heard, the same channels that you usually speak at, are saying that there's probably going to be a strike against the oil refineries in the region and possibly American military installations. I mean, what would be the consequences of that? I mean, probably a major economic crisis and a major escalation if U.S. forces are targeted. What do you think this retaliatory strike may look like, and what potential consequences will we face?
Yeah, I would imagine it would have something to do with destroying the energy infrastructure in the region in order to provoke a wider economic crisis in the West. Trump is not, I think, unaware of those risks. This is someone who sees himself as something of a business and economic savant. And I think that he's probably well aware of the risks. And of course, he knows that he was brought to office for a second time, largely due to Americans' anger over high rates of inflation. So I think one of the positive things, perhaps, is that he understands that wars have a tendency to derail domestic initiatives and the economy. So that might serve as a break on the ambitions of the American and Israeli defense establishments.
What can you say about American-Chinese relations? What to expect from Trump's administration in that regard?
I wouldn't really expect too much difference between the Biden approach and the Trump approach. The one big thing right now, and I think this is sort of silly, but it seems like Trump really has no desire to ban the Chinese app TikTok in the United States. That's a policy difference with the Biden administration. Other than that, basically, we are now, I think, unquestionably embarked on a new Cold War with China. Trump has appointed a number of very prominent China hawks to his administration. I would expect there to be, real robust competition. Of course, the whole tariffs thing, Trump is pledging to, slap tariffs on, all these imports. That's aimed at China. So there's going to be real intense economic competition, and there's going to be security competition in China's backyard, particularly, over over Taiwan, the South China Sea. They're going to continue in this effort to have the smaller states around China bandwagon against it. So really, it's going to be more of the same, with the exception, perhaps, of the TikTok ban.
There's another very interesting country in our region, about 400 miles away from Armenia. We just saw something pretty unprecedented. A whole country, a member of the United Nations, has been partitioned, invaded, with the assistance of a terrorist organization, invaded. Large parts of Syrian territory are now controlled by the Israeli forces, by forces of Tahrir al-Sham, sponsored by Turkey, and shockingly by the West. We're seeing some pretty unbelievable images of French and German foreign ministers going there to shake the hand of a manicured terrorist, basically a rebranded, reformed terrorist who was associated with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, responsible for killing 3,000 Americans in 2001. And just recently, apparently the FBI found out some links between the attack in New Orleans and ISIS. And Western leaders are going there to meet him and shake his hand. It's pretty unprecedented. Are we looking at the prospect of a partition in Syria and destabilization of Syria and therefore the region? I mean, there's a lot of potential conflicts that may ensue. One is that Turkey is already threatening the Kurds. There may be some kind of a military conflagration there. There may be some infighting within the forces that came to power. There are some tensions with the Christians, with the Druze. What will come of that? What do the recent events in Syria mean for international politics, and where's this going to go?
Well, I think it's going to lead directly to some kind of war, conflict with Iran. I think that how you laid things out is correct. Syria is really no longer a functioning state. Turkey and Israel are in the process of dividing it. There's going to be a rump Islamist caliphate run by this Jolani terrorist character. I think it's disgraceful. I think that the policy that the West, led by the United States and its allies in Syria, beginning with the Syrian conflict, about 14 years ago, is insane. What you had in Assad was, yes, a brutal dictator, all the terrible things that were said about Assad, I have no trouble believing. I also don't care, because he was the leader of a multi-confessional secular state. He allowed people to practice their religions. He was not an enemy of the United States. The accusations of chemical weapons use had all the hallmarks of Western propaganda. They were launched from the province of Idlib, which was not controlled by the Assad regime. They were controlled by the Islamist terrorists who took over that province. I believe that was al-Nusra. So what you had was someone who was a secular Arab leader fighting the very same people who attacked us on 9/11. And we did everything in our power to overthrow this person. And now we have this partition in process, urged on, of course, by Israel, by ACURA. And it is an absolute disaster for the region. And it's a disaster for the region, one, because it's going to lead to the Israelis attacking Iran. But secondly, more importantly, from Western interests, you're going to have a terrorist state, and you're going to have massive outflows of migrants into Europe, into the West. And that always spells trouble from a security standpoint. So I just find it absolutely, I have found for years our policy towards Syria to be absolutely abhorrent and nonsensical, counterproductive, and dangerous.
Thank you. It looks like the new president will have a lot on his hands. He's going to have to be the fireman of the world. He has at least 4 wars to put out. He has the conflict in Palestine. Let's use the word conflict, not to use other words. He will have Syria. He will have...
I'll use...
Oh, well, yeah, we do. We'll have Ukraine, and that's 3. And then we're going to have another one with Iran. That's going to be fun, isn't it?
Well, yeah, we've taken up the role of fireman of the world only because the previous position was that of arsonist of the world. Yes. So we set these fires and then we have to put them out. And we've been doing that now for 25 long years. And we never seem to learn from our mistakes, unfortunately.
I have a question about the current relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan. In one hand, we have different statements from Azerbaijani president who threatens Armenia with another war and who labeled Armenia as a fascist country. On the other hand, we have different statements of Armenian Prime Minister. Armenian Prime Minister keeps talking about peace. So how do you assess the situation and why we have these kind of statements from Azerbaijani president?
Well, I think because Aliyev is not any different from Erdogan in that they will say whatever they need to say at whatever time to forward their strategic objectives. These are not people who are truth tellers. They are, revanchist, vicious, Islamist leaders. And so, I wouldn't trust anything that comes out of his mouth. And I have no idea, what your prime minister is thinking. I have absolutely no idea. It seems to me that he's putting Armenia in the weakest geopolitical position possible. What could possibly be his motives? I haven't a clue. But I look at things like this Armenia US strategic agreement, and all I can think of is this means trouble for Armenia. And I think that that's a real shame.
If we were somewhere between Greece and Italy on some kind of an island and we had a strategic cooperation agreement with the US, I mean, that would be probably not a bad thing. The problem is that we have Russia and Iran from the north and the south, and signing this kind of an agreement puts us on a collision course with those countries. And we have Turkey and Azerbaijan on the eastern and the western side of us. And these countries are not our friends, unfortunately, and they're much more important for the West than we are. That's the problem. And sadly, these Western-sponsored NGOs are trumpeting from the rooftops. This is a victory for our Western policy. We're going to have, alliance with America. Well, it remains to be seen what that's going to involve. If it's going to involve more funding for, Maidan type organizations and NGOs, and let's say conferences on regional security and peacekeeping training sessions, like, what this already happened a few months ago, that's probably possible to do. But do you see the United States providing sizable military assistance, even comparable with what was given to Ukraine? I don't think so. Will there be a military base in Armenia? I don't think so. Where do you think, if there is some kind of assistance from the United States, where will it fall on this continuum from just empty promises and some symbolic gestures to actual military assistance that could even comprise 10% or 5% of what was given to Ukraine?
Right. I wouldn't expect any sort of large scale assistance. I would not rule out, however, the idea of a base in Armenia. After all, in the aftermath of the Maidan in 2014, the U.S. Army established a base in the western part of Ukraine. Doing so, though, I believe, puts a target on the backs of Armenians. It doesn't increase, from my perspective, as someone who's an American, putting an army base in Armenia doesn't increase U.S. national security. It certainly doesn't increase security for Armenians. So no, this seems to me to be, given your location, and geography, unfortunately, is destiny, as the Ukrainians are learning. This seems to me to be a very provocative move on the part of Pashinyan, because what he's doing is inviting Russia and Iran's enemies into their backyard. The Russians don't take kindly to that. There's that recent experience that the Georgians had in 2008. So it seems to me that this is a very short-sighted and even dangerous move on the part of the Armenian government.
Do you see any logic behind Pashinyan's steps? Do you see any logic in his foreign policy?
It only makes sense if his ultimate goal is to become a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington. It was the same thing with Saakashvili, right? He caused all this chaos in Georgia. The war came, then he left, and he went to live in Brooklyn. It only makes sense if he, thinks that his future is, as a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, or he wants a job in Brussels. Otherwise, I don't get it at all. And again, I say this as an American friend to Armenia. This seems to me like nothing but trouble.
All right. James, thank you so very much for your time at this early hour. And we hope to see you in Armenia, perhaps on another occasion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this interesting discussion. I want to remind you that our today's guest was James Carden, a senior advisor to the American Committee on US-Russia Accord, editor and columnist at the American Conservative, and a former advisor to the US State Department. Thank you so much for watching this interview.